Good evening. It's wonderful to see you all here for week 2 of Straight Talk, Media and Politics in a Post-Truth Era. Tonight, we take a look at alternative facts and partisan media, and with a stellar lineup of guests, you are in for a treat. Before we begin our program, I'd like to take just a few minutes to share a couple of thoughts. First, as many of you know, Charles and I moved to Greenville from Waco, Texas, and I grew up in New Orleans. As I've watched the continued devastating impact of Hurricane Harvey unfold over the past several days, I've been thinking about the people I know, my family that's still there, and the 98 Furman students and hundreds of Furman alumni, parents and friends who call Texas and Louisiana home. Many families have been displaced from or lost their homes, businesses, farms, or worse. I want them to know we're thinking of them and praying for their safety and strength to emerge from this stronger than ever. I'd like to say a couple of thank yous before turning the program over to Danielle Vinson, our moderator this evening. First, I'd like to thank former U.S. Secretary of Education and 2-term governor of South Carolina and Furman alumnus, Dick Riley. Dick Riley, whose statesmanship and pragmatic approach to addressing important issues, in particular, providing quality education for all children, is an example to us all. Thank you to the Osher. Thank you to the Osher Lifelong Learning Institute and the Riley Institute for the many hours they put into tonight's program. Thank you to Danielle Hernandez, who worked with the contractors to make McAllister Auditorium available for us this evening despite their unfinished painting as they conclude some recent repairs, so don't look too close, please. Thank you to former U.S. Congressman Bob Inglis, who made the time to be with us this evening, and to Greenville News' executive editor, Catrice Hardy. And thank you to Chuck Todd, who is incredibly busy, yet he took the time to come and share his perspective on a very important issue. He even spoke with some of our students while on campus today. Chuck, we look forward to hearing from you, and we hope you will remember your time in our fair city and at our fine university with a memory of some warm and wonderful Southern hospitality. I am certain we will long remember you. Now, I invite to the podium Furman's own Danielle Vinson, who is a Furman alumna and a professor in our Department of Politics and International Affairs. She's a consummate professional, adored by her students, and frequently seen in Washington where she meets with Furman alumni. Please join me in giving a warm welcome to Dr. Danielle Vinson.
Good evening. Thank you so much for coming. I want to let you know before I get started too far that tonight we want to give you the opportunity to ask some questions. So if you will take your program and turn on the side that does not have Chuck Todd, you will find in little itty bitty print, some of you will need your reading glasses for this, I do. You will find the number to text your questions, and you can also see it, I believe, on the screen behind me for at least a few more moments. But please do text those questions in, and we'll try to get to as many of them as possible during our conversation. The title of tonight's session is Alternative Facts and Partisan Media, Missing Walter Cronkite. My job over the next couple of minutes is to provide some context for this discussion. That means I need to start by explaining to the folks in the room who don't remember life before cable television or the internet who Walter Cronkite was. Those of you who remember, bear with me. Cronkite was the anchor of CBS Evening News from the early 1960s to 1981. In 1972, an Oliver Quayle poll found that he was the most trusted man in America. Okay, so the competition was Richard Nixon. But still, when Cronkite ended his broadcast with his signature phrase, "And that's the way it is," people generally believed him. I'm confident that no news media personality today enjoys the trust of most Americans. And if any journalist or politician, Bob, today tells us that's the way it is, they can expect an onslaught of comments and tweets challenging their version of reality. According to a Pew Research Center study released this past spring, trust in the media is lower than at any time since the question was first asked by Gallup in 1972. Only 20% of Americans have a lot of trust in the news media. Gone is Walter Cronkite's era, where most people started with the same basic information about public affairs. It's been replaced by a fragmented media environment in which partisan and other niche media are proliferating. One Pew study from 2014 found there was little overlap in the news sources preferred by liberals and conservatives, and especially those who were most likely to be interested in and active in politics. In case you're curious, liberals tend to turn to New York Times, NPR, and MSNBC, while conservatives overwhelmingly trust Fox News. When it comes to partisan media, including cable news shows, talk radio, and online publications, even if they're sharing information that's accurate, and that's not always a given, they tend to focus on different issues and facts and frame events differently depending on their party leanings and ideology. Take last night, for example. I'm a social scientist. We do these scientific experiments occasionally. At 8 o'clock last night, I flipped on the new television. I proceeded to flip very quickly from CNN, MSNBC, and Fox. CNN was Anderson Cooper standing in a hurricane. MSNBC was reporting on the latest of Mueller's Russia investigation, and Fox was reporting on the violence of Antifa protesters against conservative groups. The result is that many citizens hold competing and often mutually exclusive views about reality based on their media choice. That's not to say they don't occasionally hear information from the other side. They do. But as those of you who were here last week learned, we tend to dismiss the information we disagree with and hold to what confirms our existing biases. In the midst of this media environment, the 2016 campaign ushered in what seemed to be new levels of boldness on the part of political operatives to traffic in fake news and questionable information. Media fact-checkers went into overdrive trying to hold on to objective reality in a deluge of misinformation and disinformation. And then 2017 brought us the Orwellian term alternative facts, raising the possibility that objective reality can be changed simply by saying it is so. What an interesting time to be a journalist or a politician. Tonight, we have three people who will help us explore and understand how this era of partisan media and alternative facts affect news media and politicians, and what they're doing and can do to help the public navigate this environment. We'll start things off with the man who was there when the term alternative facts entered the lexicon. Chuck Todd is best known to many of you as the moderator of Meet the Press, the #1 Sunday morning talk show. The political junkies in the room have known him for at least 10 years as the news director at NBC and his time as NBC's chief White House correspondent during the Obama years. After Chuck's remarks, he'll be joined on stage by our other two guests, Catrice Hardy and Bob Inglis, for a conversation and to answer your questions. Catrice Hardy is the executive editor of the Greenville News and the Southeast Regional Editor for USA Today Network. At the Greenville News, Catrice leads a team of journalists who are trying to reach people where they are, including using social media platforms, podcasts, and community forums. She formerly worked at the Virginian Pilot in Norfolk, where she started as an intern and left as the news organization's managing editor. She's a graduate of Louisiana State University and a longtime member of the National Association of Black Journalists, where she's mentored younger journalists and students. We look forward to her helping us understand how local media are navigating the current environment and the role they can play in helping restore our trust in the media. Bob Inglis represented South Carolina's 4th Congressional District, where Furman is located, during 2 stints in Congress, most recently from 2005 to 2011. During his time there, Bob gained the reputation as someone who believed decisions should be based on facts, even when facts were not what his constituents or colleagues really wanted to hear. Since 2011, he's been involved in full-time promotion of free enterprise action on climate change and launched the Energy and Enterprise Initiative at George Mason University. For his work on conservative solutions to climate change, he received the 2015 John F. Kennedy Profile in Courage Award. He also has the distinction, though not nearly as well known, of being the only politician I have ever turned loose in my classes without instructions or constraints. I knew he would teach them about Congress and not use it as an opportunity for partisanship. He thinks like a political scientist, and for those of you who are uncertain, that is a compliment. We look forward to Bob giving us some insight into how politicians might approach the current media environment. But first, let's hear from Chuck Todd.
Danielle, thank you. For those of you wondering what that is a lovely cat call. That is not a negative cat call. Those are fans of the Tony Kornheiser podcast. I will let Tony know that I got La Cheeserie here at Furman as well. First, Madam President, Governor Riley, Danielle, thank you. I thought Danielle laid out this conversation extraordinarily well. And so what I'm going to try to do a little bit here tonight is, in a short way, try to give you my take of sort of how we got here, and then hopefully let us in our panel discussion try to talk about what can we do to fix it a little bit. But I do think it's important to figure out how we got here. And it is, if you look at it, there's sort of, I'm optimistic in this respect. I think 50 years from now, we're going to explain this divisive era, this era of polarization, in the same way that we explained the tumult at the turn of the 20th century. Much of this is economic anxiety, is driven by the convergence of a bunch of things. We're transitioning from an industrial economy to whatever the heck we're going to call this. And I say this, some people call it the service economy. Some people call it the tech-driven economy. That's the problem. We don't have a name because we don't know what it is, and we don't know what it looks like. And when you don't know what something looks like, that's fear sets in a little bit. So there's part of me that believes the fine political scientists of Furman 50 years from now are going to explain this era starting with that fact. And just say, in the same way that we had, if you look at our politics at the turn of the 20th century, we had a lot of fracturing. We had this transition from agrarian to industrial. We had both parties fractured in different ways. You had a populist former president leave the Republican Party and challenge. Boy, where have we seen this? The business wing of the party and the populist wing of the party totally split. Here we are today, where you can argue I think we're almost a four-party system right now in this country. But certainly, most prominent right now, it feels as if we're sort of in a three-party system. Trump's populist party, the Chamber of Commerce Republican Party, and the Democratic Party, though I would argue that they're split as well. They have a populist left and arguably a center left, sort of more business or tech-focused wing. So it is in some ways, it's extraordinarily familiar. But the media aspect of this is something that I think we're trying to figure out a couple of things. As you know, in society and in general, we usually in life, we revert to a norm. And in our country, the question is, what is our norm? Is our norm a partisan media, or is our norm an objective media? And if you look at the history of our country, you could make an argument our norm is a partisan media. It's actually a fairly recent phenomenon, starting with Vietnam War and Watergate. Sort of in the last 50 years, this idea that media definitely is sort of separated. It needs to be objective. If you look at the 19th century, there's still newspaper legacy names out there that have a political party in their title. The Arkansas Democrat Gazette, the Waterbury in Waterbury, Connecticut, the Waterbury Republican. There was a time where newspapers advertised their political allegiances right there on their masthead. And so I think that is a question we have to ask ourselves. Is our norm a partisan media? I didn't get into this business wanting that to be the norm. But is that what we're sorting ourselves in? But I guess the question is, how do we get to this distrust that we have? And I make an argument that this has been a 50-year erosion of trust between the public and the press. And there's a number of ways, there's a number of reasons of how we got here. I was tallying this up earlier today. Every single president, going back to JFK, has either seen a member of their administration become a member of the media, or a member of the media join the administration. Pierre Salinger, JFK's press secretary, worked for ABC News. Tony Snow, George W. Bush press secretary, was a Sunday show host on Fox. Jay Carney, Time magazine, Washington bureau chief, became Barack Obama. And I'm just giving you a few examples. Every single administration we've had, going back to Kennedy, has done this. Has that eroded this idea? Have we blurred the lines between journalists and politicians? And the public is distrustful of politicians, but if the public thinks the politicians, and there's a revolving door between being a politician and being a member of the media, then we suddenly are we the same watchdogs that we have pledged to be? I think that is something that we have to, I say this, I don't want to single individuals out, because I think some of them do a very fine job, do their best to put aside what their positions were when they were an active partisan, and doing their best to present themselves as providing objective analysis or objective facts. But you can't tell me that hasn't had an erosion. And it's sort of, the most prominent, frankly, Bill Moyers and Pat Buchanan. I always like to say, in some ways, at the time, they were the first ones that truly broke that barrier, that went from, Bill Moyers was LBJ, worked for LBJ, Pat Buchanan worked for Richard Nixon, and both became fairly prominent members of the media. And then just over time, it's just become sort of a norm. And now, what I think is, there are people that go into television news using it as a launching pad to run for office. And there are people that run for office hoping that it leads them to a talk show. This is messed up. And it's like, it's no wonder it's very easy then to convince the public, they're all in on it. It is. So I think that's the part where we in the press have to look at sort of that 50-year picture here. We need to build that wall again between our role as watchdogs and not hope that some sort of White Walker dragon tears down that wall again. Sorry, a little Game of Thrones humor there for you. You Game of Thrones fans will really enjoy that joke, I think. Apologies for spoiling. But we have to rebuild that wall. And I think it's going to be tough. But so that's one problem that we have that is a bit self-created in ours. Then there's a second problem, which is there is a bias in the media. I always say that I do this when people ask me about it. I check my pulse. I'm like, yeah, I'm a human being. We're born with original bias, to borrow a phrase. And it's a bias of where we grew up. It's a bias for, I'm a rabid University of Miami fan. Why? Because I grew up in Miami. That's a form of bias. I was more likely to ask questions about the issue of Cuba in the White House press room because I was a Miami native and I was sitting there. That's a form of bias, right? Somebody else not as familiar may not see that as a priority of an issue. So there's always a form of bias in the media. It's not always ideological. And where I think we in the press have created what I call reinforced a cultural bias. My father, I always say I grew up in a bipartisan household, which I think unfortunately is less and less these days. My joke is my my parents canceled each other's vote out, but at least they told each other. My grandmother says that she and my grandfather canceled each other's vote out, but they never told each other. So, we're making progress generationally, right? We're talking across the aisle. But I remember my father had this New York chip on his shoulder. And he says, they think they're better than us. They tell us, they think that, that New York-centric mentality, they think they're better than us. And when I got to NBC, I really didn't want to blame. But when I did get to NBC News, I saw that, yes, the New York mentality does have a cultural impact on how we see things or how stuff gets budgeted. And I remember the first time, you guys will really enjoy this because it involves South Carolina, the first time I realized the cultural disconnect with my colleagues in New York and myself in Washington. It was in the early 2007, 2008, so it was the 2008 campaign, and I was, part of my job as political director was also I sort of ran our polling as well, and they were like, okay, we need a South Carolina poll, we need to go in the field, and I said, well, we can't go in the middle of the week. You can't poll in the South on Wednesday nights. And literally, my colleagues up in New York are like, why? And so there is a true, when I say cultural disconnect, that's there. They don't, and this is another thing. Oh, church night, okay. And then they think, oh my God, everybody's so religious. They go to church a couple times a week. Well, sometimes church night is a community center. Sometimes it's basketball. It is amazing how they take that fact and then they painted this sort of extreme sort of caricature out there a little bit. So there is real cultural disconnect sort of in that comes from the coasts. And I think that is something that we have to be more mindful of. I say about one of the things that I think we let down voters in 2016 a little bit is we were more likely to do a story on the dreamer who might get deported than we were on the opioid addict looking for help in rural Missouri. And so here we are. So think about how that fractures trust. So they watch us on the news and they think, boy, they don't know anything about our lives. They don't know what's going on here. They don't understand what's happening here. And so I think that the culture aspect is real. The ideological aspect is not. But when you have the cultural aspect there, it is easy if you're a partisan to then exploit and take it to that next step. It becomes more believable. Well, if they don't understand my faith, and they don't understand why it is important that if you live in rural America, that you need to have protection because maybe it takes 30 minutes before first responders show up at your house if you have a problem. I had an uncle who lives in rural Arkansas and he got shot. And it took 35 minutes for somebody to show up. But luckily, he had a shotgun with him and he protected. And he said, but does that mean in New York City that they want to have? The point is we don't accept the idea that there are different ways people live sometimes in America, and that what's good for New York City is not necessarily good for Mountain View, Arkansas. And so that's the part of this that is true. And I think over time, especially as the media resources have dwindled and we've been more pressured to turn a profit, we've also withdrawn our reporters from some of these places around the country. Now, the good news is, our Chicago bureau used to be so big that we had somebody who was full-time ag reporting. We haven't had a full-time ag reporter at NBC News probably in 30 years. So that would be somebody who was if they were just working their beat, and we still had that person working their beat, we might have gotten, hey, this opioid crisis, you have no idea how bad it is out here, and we really ought to do a story. But we were missing that a little bit. And look, one of the things we're trying to do is, now that it's so easy to be mobile, we have no excuse. And we can send, if we're going to embed young journalists on every 17 presidential campaigns, why can't we embed them in 17 communities around the country? So that's something that we're trying to do. We're trying to fix, because we know that This is step one in rebuilding trust, which is can we prove to you that we understand what's happening in your community? That's step one before we repair any of this. And so that's the stuff that we need to work on. But this is not all the media. And this is sort of a point that I want to leave you with before we get to the politicians have exploited this. So they've taken the cultural disconnect and said it applies to politics far and wide. And it applies ideologically, up and down, on every single issue. And in some ways, I wish the public would ask themselves more, why does the politician so badly want you to not trust us? Ask yourself that. And, this is, I think, this is the kind of things that I think we in journalism need to push back on more and remind people more and just reinforce this idea that the politician, they're in it for themselves potentially, and you want this watchdog. And someday the politician, while this has been a successful way to maybe either avoid scrutiny or exploiting press hatred to divide and conquer and win an election, it's proven not a good way to govern. That's pretty obvious. But if we're going to fix this, it isn't journalists alone that are going to do it. It starts, frankly, with every parent in every country, in every household. My father was definitely had a point of view, but he also made sure in our house he subscribed to New Republic and National Review, and he made sure as a young he forced me to watch Meet the Press actually a lot. Bill Monroe was the moderator, if any of you remember him. I remember that's my first moderator that I remember. And he also made me watch every convention speech on each side, and he would tell me his political opinion and say, but this is why you need to understand this person's point of view. My father wanted to raise me in a bipartisan fashion. I try to do that with my kids. I'll be honest, it's been a struggle right now when you want the president to be a role model on character. No, this has been a struggle because I do not ever let my kids know who I vote for. I do not ever disparage any lawmaker in their presence. I don't do that because I don't want to raise them one way or the other. I want them to sort of come about this, I want them sort of to be exposed to a little bit of everything. But we're not doing that. Look what we're doing as a society. We're siloing ourselves out. One of the most, we're making this even worse. This poll question that's been out there that's really bothered me, this idea that somehow, I think it's something like 40 to 50% of the country would feel would be upset if their child married somebody of the opposite political party. That number was 5% in 1975. We have created this idea that the other side is the enemy. And if you dehumanize each other over time, then it really is easy to dismiss. It's really easy to demean. And we get to the situation that we've gotten here. So this is work that belongs with politicians. This is work that belongs with everybody in this room, with their kids. We got to teach civic engagement. We're afraid to do it in our schools right now because, and I understand why. You know why we're afraid to talk about civic engagement in our schools? Because somebody is going to get offended politically, or somebody's going to fear indoctrination, right? That's the part of this that is too bad. But if it's not going to happen in the schools, then it has to happen at home. It has to happen. Politicians have to have a vested interest in wanting the press to be trusted. Someday, President Trump's going to want his people to believe what we report. And he's going to regret that day when suddenly nobody is believing something that he wants people to believe. So this is, that we don't want to go down that road. on that front. So we're hopefully going to get to some answers here a little bit. I have an idea of how we got here. I think step one is admitting we have a problem. Yeah. Hello, I'm a journalist. But we've got to want to fix this together, because this political discourse, I mean, I'll be honest, I feel like we're in a tinderbox. I'm oddly thankful for Houston right now. Houston's brought us together. It's tragic that we have to wait for a crisis like this. But it's heartwarming at the same time. And I think about the fact that, look, I grew up in a hurricane alley. You guys are in a hurricane alley. We know what it's like. Just suddenly you think everything's fine, and suddenly you're like, everything's gone. And so maybe this is a moment that we realize, oh, wait a minute, there's larger challenges in life than political bias and winning a political argument. But we know this isn't going to last. And at some point, I hope that there's enough folks out there that say enough is enough. But some of this has to come from you. Has to come from the consumer of news, the consumer of politics. Because at the end of the day, every election result is a reflection of us. And for better or for worse, that election result, we may not, it reflected our country. And so we've got to everybody in this room has got to sort of take charge of this and say, okay, I want to make this better. So hopefully we can start answering those questions now. So thank you very much.
I'm going to come back in a moment to where Chuck left off, but I've got to ask this one question. When Jill told me we had Chuck Todd coming, I was like, there's one question I must ask immediately. When you heard the word alternative facts in that interview, what went through your mind? Take your microphone.
Look,
don't forget, y'all have to talk into the microphones or they can't hear you.
Look, I want to tell you, I was very upset that Saturday. No. I was very upset that Saturday when I saw it, and I'm like, why do this? And so when she said what she said, you're just like, I guess in hindsight, it feels like the "a few good men" moment. Wait, you ordered the code red? But look, there was a few things there that I regret. I regret getting a little too emotional personally. I mean, I think that is something I regret. She got mad at me at one point. I can't believe you're laughing. And I was laughing at the absurdity of all of it, but I do think it was, it came close to where I lost my cool. And I don't want to ever get in that. So, this clip has always been a little bit of, I think it's defining of this administration, whether, they've got that this is going to be a defining moment for them on the interaction with the press. But it was one of those, you knew the minute you heard it, you went, oh boy, that's going to go viral. But I'll tell you one thing, a lot of people, I got a little criticism for using the word falsehood. I had a lot of people ask me, why didn't you use the word lie? And I specifically, I refuse to use the word lie unless you can prove something is like. Lying gets at motive. At the end of the day, I don't know. I'm not inside that person's head. So one of the things, and I also believe when you call somebody a liar, that's a personal dig. And the minute you do that, then you lose the interview, then it becomes a personal shouting match, and then you're not having a conversation, which is why I went out of my way to keep saying falsehood over and over again, so that you didn't, I didn't want the word lie, because that can get abused, if you would. But it was, it's to this day, I have to admit, I don't love the clip. It's a very uncomfortable thing to go viral.
Thank you. All right, I want to pick back up on what you said toward the end of your remarks about politicians and the role that they are playing in some of this era of partisanship and alternative facts. And I want to start with Bob on this, and then Catrice, I'm going to come back to you because I know you guys cover a lot of local politicians here in Greenville. What role do you see politicians playing in contributing to some of these problems, but also do they have a role or responsibility in helping us deal with this era of partisanship and alternative facts? Is there a way that they can sort of help us find a more stable equilibrium?
Well, yes, there is something they can do. We just find a little bit of courage to speak to the people that they represent and actually try to tell them some truth, right? That's the thing that would help the most. But here's the thing, politicians are scared of us, their voters, but they are terrified of the activist within their own party. And so the activist will absolutely eat you and your family alive. And so what you find is Democrats plastering themselves up on the left-hand wall and Republicans plastering themselves up on the right-hand wall with no daylight between them and the activist. And whatever the activists say has to be true. And so it's really a crazy time, right? Because what the activists say is simply not true. You know, I mean, Barack Obama was born in Hawaii. He was not born in Africa. And so, you know, if you point that out, then you're getting daylight between you and that right-hand wall. And so then it comes to us as people, doesn't it? Pogo said, we've met the problem and the problem is us. And so it's all about us. It's about whether we're going to say to those activists, why don't you hush up just a little bit? Because what you're saying is just nonsense. And what we're all looking for here is that sort of Houston moment of coming together and saying, we got some problems to solve, and really they're solvable if we just come together. So it ends up being our responsibility, because the politicians will follow our lead. Politicians typically follow, they don't lead. And so what we have to do is establish a constituency for this kind of reasonable action.
Catrice, what do you expect of politicians? Is there a way they can help in terms of they're reaching out to the media or the things that they say in the press? Are there ways that they can help combat the problem of misinformation, disinformation that we're seeing a lot of times as a result of some of the partisan battles and the efforts to spin information? What have your experiences been with the local politicians? Not necessarily here, but elsewhere where you've worked?
Well, I think, you know, one of the most important things that we would like is just to have an open, engaging conversation. And so what we find a lot with politicians is they're hard to reach. And so as a result, you find yourself in a situation where you're covering something, maybe it's some information about just simply as a campaign finance report. And you want to be able to explain to the public why someone took a lot of money from, say, a certain industry. You want to be able to explain, looks like you had a vote here, what's the connection? But you can't do that because they don't return phone calls, and because you can't have that open dialogue. And so what often happens is you face this decision of, should the reporter go forward with this story and write it and say no comment? Because I think by using that language, it appears as if a politician or whoever you're writing about has something to hide. That's probably not the case in many instances, but that's all we have to go with. And so I think our struggle has been to be more transparent, to say what we've done in order to engage a politician. And so I've always felt like we should go above and beyond for certain stories. We should try to go to their homes if possible, if we know they're in town. We should try to go to open meetings they have so that we can say in our stories, we called the office, we left a message at their home, but we don't often do that enough. And I think the public then comes across as, well, it looks like maybe the media has an axe to grind, or it looks as if the politician was hiding something, when it might not, it's probably not the case, but that's all we have to go on.
Okay. I want to ask one more question, and then we're going to hit the audience questions. Don't worry, I'm not forgetting you. Politicians have been spinning for a long time, right? They are going to, when they talk, they're going to pick out the facts and information that benefit their side. in media circles, or those of us who study this, we call it framing. And it's actually a good idea in winning battles and debates, because how you frame something determines the possible solutions to a problem, for example. So we're used to smart politicians framing, but is there a line between spin and alternative facts? And if so, where's the line, and how do you in the media deal with the person that steps over the line and goes from simple spin to misinformation or disinformation? Who wants to start?
Look, I'd start. One of the things that I always say is difficult is a lot of times in a political debate, and you have an issue disagreement, one campaign will claim the other side is lying and vice versa, and they're saying, they're, and it may be because, and sometimes even the way we fact check, we may fact check something that says, well, so-and-so is proposing this tax cut. They claim it's going to create jobs. A tax cut like this 30 years ago didn't create jobs. And so therefore, we in the media is going to say that is not true. That's a falsehood that they uttered. But what we also don't take into account is maybe that person's proposal is also counting on sort of this perfect scenario where the tax cut matches this part of spending, and then, it isn't implemented the exact same way. And we're having a debate, what I call is on future facts, which is we're having a debate about outcomes. I think that evidence in the, when it comes to tax cuts, do tax cuts create jobs or not? I think we have to do a better job of presenting evidence that is circumstantial, not definitive. So I think sometimes we're too definitive when we fact check our politicians, when in fairness to them, their ideas are based on an idealistic scenario, which, by the way, nothing wrong with that. Right? You want somebody to present, healthcare for all. You want the idealistic scenario. That's part of it. That's what when activists are idealists, that's when the two sides work. When activists become pugilists, that's when it's not working. So I do think that is something, and I love what you said about campaign finance. Like how we word a no comment can imply a negativity to the public. And so I think we do need to be mindful that it is a political debate and we're presenting circumstantial fact-checking, not pure fact-checking sometimes.
Anybody else want to weigh in on that?
Well, I would say from my perspective, so what we often do too is we kind of have, so this politician has this tax cut plan. Well, the left says this and the right says that, but we don't really get into the middle. And often what you find is it's much more complex than the left or the right or the opponents or the proponents. There's all this information out there that can say maybe some components of this plan could work and other components might be more detrimental. I think we have to do a better job of finding those voices that can see the insides of an issue, but they're not taking it from the right or the left per se.
I got to say, Catrice, and for Channel 4 that may be here, in the 12 years in Congress, I really was very fairly covered by the Greenville News and by 4 and 7. And maybe there's some districts where that's not the case. I got a friend in North Carolina serving in Congress a while back. He said that the Asheville Citizen Times called him up. I realize that's his newspaper. Called him up for comment. He commented, and he said next day read in the paper that he was unavailable for comment. Now, I don't know whether I really believe him about that, because I just never had that experience. I mean, the Greenville News covered me straight up. I didn't like every quote exactly, and they didn't frame it exactly the way I wanted it, Danielle, but I got good time and good coverage. I will say now it's a different scenario. I mean, back when I first ran for Congress in 1992, there were actually reporters who came out to press conferences. It's really a unique experience today. I mean, you don't have that, right? Now people self-publish. And so I think there is a difference. To answer your question, Daniel, there's a difference between spin and making stuff up. So you do want to spin, as Chuck was saying. You want to say, this tax cut plan is going to create growth. That's fine. That's within the range. But when the media is presented with a new scenario that Chuck was describing earlier of Donald Trump saying that Barack Obama wiretapped Trump Tower. Now, this is a really difficult thing to deal with, I think, from the media's perspective. Because what I heard, for example, in NPR as reporting that, without evidence, comma, Donald Trump asserted today, in some places, I imagine people were inclined to say, as a falsehood, comma, Donald Trump said today, because it's beyond the pale. It's not like anything you've ever experienced. What do you mean he wiretapped Trump Tower? Do you have any evidence of that? You can't just say things. And so,
But it's interesting on that. And this is where this becomes very difficult. Do we have an obligation in the press of expressing, why did he say that? Where is he pointing to? Now, there was something he was pointing to. He may have found out that one of his friends was being wiretapped. Now, maybe it was their phone that was being wiretapped. They worked in Trump Tower, but it wasn't happening in Trump Tower. So that's the real challenge here, is that he'll take something that there is a grain of truth that isn't true about this, but it's a fact, and you grab it from over here, you put it here, and that's been, to me, that's the weaponization of news, right? Yeah. Of information. Partisans have weaponized information. And that is a way of how the president weaponized a piece of information. The fact of the matter is, yes, the FBI and NSA did end up because they were monitoring some Russians. And some Americans ended up being gathered into that intel. Did Barack Obama order it? So it was during the Obama administration. So he takes this, so then his supporters will say, well, what about that? And whataboutism, don't even get me started on whataboutism. And that is to me the extra challenge. And to me that's where the politicians have a responsibility here, not to do that, but the voters are the ones that have to punish them for it. I don't think we can punish them. Our punishment is not going to be accepted.
All right, we have a question from Roxanne. What are the long-term effects of constant criticism of the mainstream media, and does it undermine democracy? Who wants it?
Let me quote you on, Matt Cooper is a former Newsweek reporter, used to be an amateur stand-up comic. And emphasis on the word amateur. But he said, imagine if we took the art of how we practice our campaigns now and applied it to everyday products. So imagine if Anheuser-Busch and Miller used political consultants and political advertising tactics to go after each other. Miller Lite says it's less filling, but what they don't tell you is blah, 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 right? And Anheuser-Busch claims it's the king of beers, but what they don't tell you, the question is, over time, would people stop buying Anheuser-Busch or stop buying Miller? Or eventually, if you're telling them the beer is not, they're lying to you about what's in their can, eventually you might stop drinking beer. So that's my fear here, that we have the constant, and now the left is basically using the tactics of the right in trying to work the refs, us in the media, so much, and claiming falsehoods and distrust all the time. I understand why I have relatives that say, I don't know what to believe. And that's what's happened, is that all of that noise, the public has just heard, I don't know what to believe. It's all of it. And that's my fear, is that we're not going to stop watching NBC or stop watching Fox. We're going to stop watching news. That's not a good thing.
I also think that and so you're on television all the time, people know you, they want to relate to you. I think certain media, so I came from the print world, and so we wanted to hide behind a name. And so we dehumanize ourselves in many ways. We didn't put ourselves out there. We didn't let you know that we are a part of this community as well. We live here. We care about the politician up the street because the decisions they make might have an effect on my daughter's school, or the budget that's going to impact what projects are built. And so I think we have to do a better job of letting our communities know that we're here to serve them and we want to be a part of the solution. And so I think that comes from joining in conversations and hosting conversations about some of the major issues in our communities. But I do think TV has done a better job of that. I just don't think the rest of us have caught up.
Bob, I'm going to put you on the spot here because I've got several questions from folks that all relate directly to you and your time in Congress. So a couple of them, and I'll try to merge them. Y'all bear with me because I'm reading and I'm trying to listen at the same time, and I'm not that good at that. One person is remembering that you kind of went through a transformation from your first time in Congress to your second time in Congress. And the second go-round, there was a lot of emphasis on facts, and particularly on the environmental issues, because I think that's one I know I've heard you publicly talk to students about. Your first time in Congress, you were more business-oriented when it came to the environment, and the second time around, you actually saw where you might bring those things together. How does a member of Congress or a politician go through these kinds of transformations, and what allows some of them to accept facts more readily and do what I think you've done, which is look for solutions that still comport with your ideological leanings, as opposed to denying that those facts exist or trying to downplay their significance?
Yeah, it was Inglis 2.0, the new and improved version, that
Yes.
was better.
And he marketed it that way, and it was one of the best advertising campaigns I've ever seen in Congress, by the way.
And by the way, it's exactly what Chuck was describing early in his talk. Back in 2004, when I ran again, it was okay to be talking Inglis 2.0, the new and improved version, and we're going to be focused on energy security, and the road to energy independence runs through South Carolina. We get these assets, you know, with low rolling resistance tires at Michelin, and General Electric making wind turbines, and BMW talking about hydrogen cars, and George W. Bush was talking about hydrogen cars. All that made sense, right? And then came the Great Recession. And the awareness of this problem of automation, globalization that's threatening my way of life, and people became very fearful. And so at that point, they wanted the tried and true. They didn't want this new and improved version. So I think that's what happened to me. I also have heard somebody say very wisely recently that a politician needs to lead in such a way as to move their constituents slowly enough for them to understand where they're going. And I didn't do that very well, I don't think. I sort of presented like, okay, it's a different sounding thing, because what they wanted to hear was, ain't it so bad? We're done for. And I wanted to say, you know, no, things are coming up roses. I mean, it's morning in America, Ronald Reagan again, you know? In fact, our slogan that Brent Nelson here probably helped us come up with, there he is, in 2010 was America's sun is still rising, right? Well, that's morning in America. It's just a rehash of Reagan. But at the time, that's really when I would mark a real downturn in the way that people wanted to hear politics. They wanted to hear it as he is a secret Muslim, non-American socialist. He must be destroyed. Speaking of Barack Obama, of course. And so you might not be able to recognize him from that description. But anyway, so particularly after he preached in Charleston, I think it was pretty hard to find that as a secret Muslim sermon, I would think, down there at Charleston at the funeral for the folks at AME. So anyhow, so it really changed, and I was caught in the midst of that change. And it's a tough time now for politicians. I mean, I know a lot of politicians who would like to lead, but they are very frightened of the people who are very frightened. And so they figure that they'll just sort of try to stay in place to keep the next craziest guy or lady from taking over. Because if they take over, for goodness sakes, where are we going to end up? You know, and so we're sort of stuck in this spot where we're waiting for this constituency I was talking about earlier to arise and say, we're here and we're ready for you to lead. Let's have an adult conversation about the deficit. Let's talk about globalization. Let's talk about automation. How's this going to work out for us? then we could, but it has to come from us in order for them to hear that and decide that they can lead.
All right, I have, by the way, thank you to Nathaniel and Jimmy for those questions. All right, I've got a couple of questions here related to possibly why folks might have lost trust in the media. So we'll start with Catrice and Chuck on these two. First of all, this one's from Alan, how does one go about removing the sensationalism from news and politics, and particularly when the president right now is promoting a lot of sensationalism?
That I've had, why don't you just ignore his tweets? President speaks. Like, it's hard to do that. Why should I decide what the viewer, am I supposed to edit the president? Like that feels, that doesn't seem right either. And so, no, I think that this is a challenge. Now, I'll tell you this is another way where we, both of our industries, and frankly, it used to be TV was the biggest problem in this, and I would argue digital is now has a bigger problem when it comes to the issue of what I would call ratings. You could make a case that you would have a ratings, we're a for-profit enterprise in television news, and so ratings matter, okay? I say, my bosses would deny this to the day, but I think my future at NBC News is going to be based on how I perform via ratings, not necessarily how I perform as a moderator. And I hope that isn't, it's the first time I've had a job where I don't feel like I'm being judged on the merits. So I'll be honest, it's very nervous. It's a little nerve-wracking that way. You're like, it's something else is in charge of you. Well, what used to be a television phenomenon, right? And so look at how we warped local news and TV, right? If it bleeds, it leads, right? You want to do that. So that began the sensationalism. Well, the worst thing that happened to digital journalism was this idea, and this has got to be a challenge for you, which is traffic. You need traffic, and the idea of clickbait. And how many times, Congressman, have you read a story and thought, oh, that story was fair, but that headline was ridiculous? Yeah. And so then the headline implies bias. And by the way, as the author, you sit here and go, I didn't write the headline. Or, right, but every news organization, and look, this is across the board. I don't want to pick on you here, Catrice, but every news organization has an editor now whose job it is to tweak a headline, to make it more clickable. And I'll tell you something else that's horrible, that's been a bad situation. The most read, the worst thing that reporters ever got was to find out who's the most read on a website. What are the most read articles? Every reporter, I can tell you this, is very competitive. You want to write the story that everybody is reading today. And you look there, so what does that mean? And I didn't get into the top 5 today. Maybe I'm going to up my lead. Maybe I'm going to sensationalize my lead a little bit. Or maybe I'm going to do another follow-up story on this ridiculous, tabloidy, maybe I'm going to write a second story on Melania Trump's heels because I know people will click on it and I'll get traffic to the site rather than just doing a second-day story on what relief is needed or something like that because it may not get the traffic. So this is something that I think we've got to put this genie back in the bottle. I don't know how we do it.
So I agree.
You're still for profit, right?
Absolutely. Wouldn't be there if not.
Exactly.
So you're absolutely right. Every day, we live and die by the chart beat metrics that tell us what people are reading, how long they're reading it, how we're engaging with them. But what I'll tell you is that at the end of the day, I didn't get into journalism for that. I got into journalism, and call me crazy, because I wanted to help tell amazing stories about people in the community. And so where I think people like me and other editors have a key role in this is policing the stories that our journalists are doing. I much prefer to have an amazing story about someone doing something so cool in our community, and we put a video with that, and maybe there's a podcast that goes with that, and that's how I get those views, than to have, and and we could all do this. How many times have you seen a video on a Metro website about cats? Drives me nuts. We could do that every day and get all the clicks we need, but that, I don't want that.
Good.
I'd get a big number every Sunday if Meet the Press were nude. I mean, like, okay. I mean, we know what gets traffic on the web, right? Okay. But is that what we want? Yeah.
And so it's integrity. You can't, once you've lost it, you can't earn it back. It's very difficult. So we have to stay, our brand, the Greenville News or NBC News, it means so much more than clickbait and getting it wrong. We had a horrible headline this week, and I will not repeat it, in the Anderson Independent paper. And it was a story about Lindsey Graham. And we didn't write it. Someone else from afar put the headline on the story. We'd actually had a conversation about that was the wrong headline to put, and they still placed it there. And we owned up to it. We had a front page column. We immediately went and called him about it. We immediately put something online about it. We also have to own our mistakes. And it didn't matter that someone else far away wrote it. We just had to accept responsibility because at the end of the day, our brand is on the line.
I want to push back on something you said about covering the president a little bit, or actually more just ask, because this came up this past spring when I was teaching a group of students on media and politics, and particularly for the current president, he thrives on the spotlight. And yes, journalists have a responsibility to cover the president, but when did it become necessary to cover utterance live verbatim? I'm curious because, and this is where I'm curious because, for example, after that press conference or press briefing, really, the day after the inauguration, or that Saturday after the inauguration, where Sean Spicer came out and I think it was 5 facts, 4 of which were just not right, provably incorrect. Why then, if you have a pattern of something like that, do you continue to broadcast the press briefing live? If people really want to see it, that's why God made the internet and whitehouse.gov.
Well, look,
I'm curious. What is the logic there?
I think the worst thing that happened to press briefings was television. I'm one of these people that doesn't want the White House press briefing televised. I can tell you this, whenever it wasn't televised, it was a much more easygoing back and forth. It was quicker questions. There was no preening, okay? I'd like to think I didn't preen on air. But sometimes Robert Gibbs would preen, and I might preen, whatever. We might go back and forth. You turn those cameras off, he's not preening anymore, we're not preening anymore. So I do think that for a whole separate reason, I think, look, the press briefing became televised during Monica. It was sort of one of those things, and it was cable that did it. Cable's like, oh, and it was sort of, we just said one day we're going to turn the cameras on and we're going to do this. Just about, it would basically be one briefing a week was on TV back in the sort of Bush days or in the first term of Clinton. And so that was but that's a separate fact. I want to go back though to this issue of the president. I struggle with this. There are days that I believe, like, look, we're gonna not go down the rabbit hole he wants us to go down, but you acknowledge what he's doing, and you say, okay, here's what it appears that this is, where we're going here, that's about, or here's the bigger story today, and I can do that. The problem is, and I wanted to mention this in our last question, is we are now held responsible for some other network's mistakes. We are now held responsible for some blogger's mistake. We are now held responsible for a bad Drudge headline. We didn't do it. But that's I think one of the things that I wish some of our colleagues would realize is when they screw up, it reflects on all of us. And, while we only, and that's been really hard when you can't control your own credibility. We've been all lumped together like this, and, when Fox or CNN makes a mistake, it doesn't reflect on Fox and CNN, it reflects on the media. And that isn't helpful either. And it's like, that's something that we have to remember. Don't jump on an opponent when they're having a bad day. when a competitor in the news business, because if you're demeaning them, it's the same thing as you're hurting all of us on that front.
You know, Daniel, I think that there's a challenge for Catrice and for Chuck is, do you cover the rally? At the rally, some things are going to be said that would normally be news, like, oh my gosh, the President of the United States just said X, Y, and Z. I mean, if George W. Bush had said some just outrageous things, you'd think the man's losing his marbles. If Ronald Reagan had said something, you'd say Alzheimer's really has gotten him. And so it'd
By the
be
way,
like,
if I said the word Alzheimer's and Reagan, I would be abused on social media right now. You can get away with it.
oh yeah, because I mean, it's
social
okay.
media.
I mean,
Inglis said it, not Todd.
It's okay. He was a great president. I think he's a very fine president. He also had a debilitating disease at the end, and a lot of us have family members who deal with those kind of things. So, so you got a question. Yes, do you cover the outrageous? But if you don't cover the outrageous, you're saying, oh, this is just the way it is now. Which is a rather strange place for you to be. It's like, oh, that's not news that the president just said something that's completely outside of the range of reality. Then you've got,
Yeah.
then
you're, I don't know how you don't
but
cover that,
but,
right?
right, and then the hard part though is I do worry that there are some of our colleagues, and we all feel this way. I think personally sometimes I feel this way. Is our role to say, you know, that isn't the proper way a president acts? Is that our job to say that in the media sometimes?
Yes, or either call
I
in
don't know if that
experts.
is, I think you have to say it in such a way, we've never seen a president act this way. No, I mean
I
that.
think that's right.
No, that
Yeah,
matters.
that's right.
I'll let you decide whether that is acceptable. Ultimately, it's your decision as the voter. Remember, the only parameter we put on somebody being president is natural-born citizen and 35 years old. We didn't do anything else on this front. So I think sometimes we have to, and I think we got to be careful when we lecture, that it doesn't sound like we're telling you what you should think. We need to present the evidence and let you get there in your own terms.
Yeah. To follow up on that, because I think you're absolutely right. I think if the media started doing too much of this is not how a president acts, then it does create the trust problems for the press. I think that's where experts, and I don't mean politicians who need a job, no offense. You have one. You've got a very good one.
I'm a recovering politician.
You're a recovering politician. Newt Gingrich is not the person I have in mind when I say this, but I mean, academics, I know we don't always talk very eloquently when it comes to the media, but that's where historians can walk in and say, we've never had a president do this before, and it takes it out of the media being the ones to say this, but it gets the idea out there, it provides some context, and so that may be one way to deal with it. And I think also, rather maybe than reporting things live as they happen and just let them unfold, yeah, have somebody there record, get the crazy comments, and then report them not necessarily straight from the president's mouth or whichever politician is saying this, but have it someone else saying, this is what the president or this is what this politician said today. That cuts the sensationalism a little bit. You've still reported it so people can do it, talk about it and think about it, but it also kind of brings down the level of crazy rhetoric to some extent. I've seen that just in if you watch court cases, this is one of those geeky things that social scientists have to do from time to time, studying the way media cover the courts when cameras aren't allowed in the courtroom. It's a much more clinical presentation of a trial, even when the trial itself could be extremely sensationalistic. But the reporters aren't going to rise to that level of sensationalism that you might see in the courtroom. If you've got cameras in the courtroom, it's a totally different report.
By the way, it's also a totally different set of lawyers and how they act.
Yes, that's true.
TV changes how
that's true.
people behave.
Yeah. So that is an interesting dilemma, though, I think, for the media. And you've got to report certain things, but how do you do it in a way that keeps the sensationalism a little bit in check?
I will say, though, if you, and every time, whatever politician did something, you went and asked an expert every time, has anyone ever done that before? And you did that over and over and over, that's a problem, too.
Yes.
Because your community will start to think that you
Right.
are biased.
This leads really nicely into our next question from Stephanie, which for the journalist, do you ever find it difficult to keep your own opinions from affecting your choice of questions or the comments you make? And how do you deal with that with the people that work with you, and particularly in your case with the reporters that work for the news?
Sure. I mean, look, I try really hard to do the devil's advocate approach on each side, to try to take the point of view of the opponent sometime, particularly in a policy debate, sort of to try to question a conservative as a liberal might be listening, and question a liberal as a conservative might be listening. That's the mindset I want to try to have going into an interview. But I've never had a problem sort of removing myself. Until it's about character, and then it's very difficult. And we've had a few character moments because this is where then the sort of the sap in me who got in. I love politics. I love American history. I went to Washington because I was just in awe of people that served. I thought I held members of Congress on a pedestal, and I just I was very idealistic about our system of government. I'm very idealistic about what and so on character questions, it's been harder when it's on character, because to me you can't balance character, right? There isn't two sides. Well, there can be two sides to a character debate, but that isn't really a side most people don't want to be on the other side of a character debate. So on those things, it can be difficult when the issue of character comes up with a president or any lawmaker that you're dealing with.
And I think, honestly, I have conversations all the time with reporters about what we're going to ask. And so a part of that really, a big chunk of that really has to do with the research you've done ahead of time. To do your homework, to find out all aspects of whatever issue you're interviewing someone about, and then sitting down for the sensitive stories, I would say, and having a conversation with a group of people from different perspectives to ensure that you're hitting all those questions in as objective way as possible. But he's right. Like, when it comes to character, we're human. We're like anybody else, and that's a struggle.
I've got several questions here that are all sort of related, and so I'm going to toss them out there because it starts to get us to how do we solve this problem, which you said you wanted some answers, so let's see if we can come up with some. Both of these deal with how do you get younger people, whether college students or, in the case of one of these folks, high school and middle school students, how do you get them to read and watch news from different media sources? How do you get them engaged in being part of the community and starting early with this idea of civic education? And those coming from Mebby and also Jim. Ideas?
I've got one. After we finish getting conservatives on board with climate change, my next cause is going to be bringing the bringing Australian compulsory voting to America. In Australia, this is the way it works. You register at 18. If you don't show up to vote, you get a ticket in the mail. It's about $50 or $75. And you didn't show up to vote, you got to pay. And so what members of parliament say there is it forces the conversation into the middle. Because everybody's coming to the party. You do not have to whomp them up with some really juicy stuff in order to get them to show up at that primary. They're coming. All of them are coming. And so you better be talking media and policy preference, what political scientists talk about,
I
right?
like this.
Rather than the extremes. And the result is a very different conversation. Now, that, by the way, doesn't solve all problems. Australia has problems that persist.
They've been through quite a few prime ministers, I think, in the last year.
Yeah. And particularly on the issue that I'm working on right now, they've had a lot of trouble. But it does. I mean, I'm being a little bit facetious about my Don Quixote kind of thing, but it would change the conversation. Somehow we have to get people to turn out and vote. Let me give you an example. When I got tossed out in 2010, 18% of the electors showed up to vote. Now, my opponent got 71% of that vote, and I, after 12 years in Congress, got the other 29%. Chuck, and Catrice, after 12 years in Congress, has a rather spectacular faceplant. But,
I know.
But that means that 13% of the district fired me, right? But that's the way it works in the American political system. And that's the challenge. I was talking about earlier about that right-hand wall and that left-hand wall. Those people that turned out at that runoff, everybody else in South Carolina was at the beach. So the people who came out and voted, they were really charged up. And so that's the challenge, is that's how we're choosing, the real challenge is in the districting, some of that's gerrymandering. Okay, so now we can add another list. So I got compulsory voting, I got California style. That's a strange thing for a South Carolina politician to say something good about California style, but California style citizen commission on redistricting might be a good idea in other places. It's created some competitive districts in California. And perhaps also the California and some other Western states concept of it can be 2 Democrats or 2 Republicans going into the general election. That's an interesting way to fix that left wall, right wall problem. That's what I identify as the main problem we're facing, is that we got people slammed on the right, slammed on the left, and so compulsory voting, California-style redistricting, still we've got the big sort going on, and that's a challenge that I don't know what the answer to that is, where people show up in the same districts in suburban Atlanta because they're just that kind of folk, and they like their neighborhood, and they tend to like each other there, and they have the same views. I don't know how to solve that one, but the other things might help us.
Look, I'm going to add one more thing to what I think we need to fix on the broken politics side of this, because look, I think we can't correct the media polarization and distrust issue without fixing this issue. I'll give you an example now. The big data has been terrible with American politics. It has been misused. We have used big data we have weaponized big data for partisan gain, whether it is being able to draw the perfect district that we can tell you in advance which party's going to win a district, and be able to draw, oh wait, that street has 5 Republicans on it, that street has 3, let's go with 5 over here, and we can, so we're using, by the way, you could use big data to create more competition. State of Iowa does this. California, I am intrigued by it. I like the idea that in a Democratic-leaning district, if you have top 2 Democrats, and we had this in one of the districts where they had to then appeal to the 30% of Republicans in that district. Yeah. And I remember in one race, you had 2 Democrats facing each other, and one of them voted against TARP. And they used that vote to appeal to the conservatives in the district. That's a healthy thing. That engaged the entire, so I'm intrigued by it. Iowa accounts for partisanship. They use competitiveness. Now we have this big Supreme Court case, and it could be in a very important moment that that they're going to take, and we may have an interesting ruling on this. But I want to get back to the big data issue. We had a primary in Virginia recently for governor. We're one of the 2 states that hold our gubernatorial elections this year, this odd year, the first odd year after a presidential. And 3 times, my wife, we have no party registration in Virginia, which as a journalist I love, right? I vote in every primary I can, Republican, Democrat. People, you look at the list, voter lists, that keep track, nobody quite sure if I'm a Republican or a Democrat, which is just the way I like it. My daughter one time told somebody, my dad's a Republican and a Democrat. I said, great answer. But this person, my wife, has voted in a lot of Democratic primaries. And so the 2 Democratic campaigns kept coming to the door, doing door knocking. I'd answer the door, And they'd ask for my wife by name, and I said, she's not here. All right, we'll come back. You don't want to try. We now, in the way we practice politics, and the operatives do this, we now give people a list. Only knock on the doors of the known members of your party here. So imagine if you're in a neighborhood and you're in a street. And I was thinking about my neighbor across the street, and here's this canvasser for a political campaign going up and down the street. And you know what's going on in your neighborhood, and you think, oh, I'm looking forward to this person coming to my house. And then they don't come. And you think, what, they don't want my vote? Well, you know what, screw them, I don't want their vote. Yeah. We now campaign in a polarized manner. Political strategists have to stop this. Yeah. We have allowed data to just totally skew with how we even compete in elections. You, the candidate, now can only talk to every single person that may vote in a primary. So our members of Congress represent the majority of people who vote, not the majority of the people that are in the district.
Catrice, I want to, they've now solved our electoral system for us. Catrice, I'm going to come back to you on the question of how do you get younger people interested in following the news, because I think the Greenville News has made some efforts in that. I noticed you've covered some things that younger people have done. The young woman that's trying to get the name changed at Wade Hampton, for example. So you've taken some things that young people have done seriously and looked at them as newsworthy. Is that a conscious decision? Do you have other things that you're doing to try to reach younger people, and how can others in the audience who'd like to get younger people paying attention can follow up with that?
Absolutely. I think we've also gone out and tried to hire, so we have a new Clemson reporter who the Greenville News and the Anderson Independent share, and she's right out of school, and she's kind of, her whole job is to be embedded at Clemson, to go to Clemson like a student and to cover those stories from that perspective. So we love trying to reach out in our community and find those stories that the kids are talking about. A lot of the people on staff, we have some younger people, but we have a lot of parents on staff. And so they're coming in every day sharing stories about what the kids are talking about. So our job is to try to be in that place, but we use video a lot for that. We know that the younger audience, that's how they get a lot of their news, that's how they relate. I mean, YouTube, my daughter has taught herself so many things on YouTube, it's unbelievable. So if we can play in that space better, I think that's helpful. And it's also just getting out and engaging. So, we try to field a number of requests to have journalists, young journalists, or even middle school students come to the newsroom, visit, spend time with us. We've tried to open our doors to folks who've asked us if they can come in for workshops. So we do actively look to have a more diverse readership, and hopefully one day they'll be able to buy our products. That is the goal. So.
And Danielle, if I could add, I think one of Catrice's daughter and students here are my hope for how this is going to change. Is that I think that young people are more discerning consumers of information than their parents, and especially their grandparents. My chief of staff, who might be here, I don't know, Wayne Roper's mother was not clearly going to vote for me in 2010. Why? Well, she'd seen some things on the internet. Oh my gosh. Did you know that members of Congress, after just one term in office, get $1 million in retirement pay? Did you know that? Now, you try to explain to them, why would anybody run for re-election? The salary is $174,000. Why would anybody run for re-election? If they had one term, they would quit, right? Well, not Mrs. Roper. She wasn't buying it. She said to Wayne, well, Wayne, they wouldn't write it if it weren't true. And it's because she grew up, Chuck, in the environment that you talked about that was probably the aberration in American history, nonpartisan media. She believed Walter Cronkite, and she believed the Greenville News when they put it in the paper. So when she reads something on the internet, Mrs. Roper was thinking it's probably so. All I got to say is, if a member of Congress gets $1 million after one term, I wonder what a governor gets. Governor Riley, what are you? It must be huge. It must be huge. Somebody put that on social media. Ask Governor Riley what he's.
Okay, now that we're starting social media rumors, this seems a good time to ask Kathy's question. As an average citizen, what would give her some advice on distinguishing facts from alternative facts and judging the significance of those various issues that crop up?
I keep coming back to common sense. It goes to what the congressman just said. It's like, well, if that were true, then why would we bother with X? You know, and so it is amazing to me the lack of common sense that's used with how people sort of just accept what's there. But look, social media has not been good to our industry. In fact, I would say it is. Look, I love to go on Twitter and spout off about University of Miami football, and spout off about how the SEC is overrated, and spout off on, you know, it's like the ACC doesn't get enough credit, you know. University of Miami invented modern college football, things like that. But I think many of my colleagues have actually popped off a little too much on social media on the political news of the day or some other news of the day, and I think that hasn't helped reputations. I don't think it's good if reporters come across as snarky or a little too dismissive of certain things, and I think it has been a little unbecoming, and it's left a bad taste in the mouth of some elected leader staff, and they sit in it, and that's something I think we've got to be careful of on social media. That when, you know, I always say I'm always on. I assume I'm going to be quoted all the time. You know, I'd love to live off the record, but I can't. I assume anything is going to get is going to be out there, so I try to be somewhat careful. And that's too bad. I mean, you know, I've been as candid as I think I can be without getting my career destroyed on social media. But, you know, both of us could get fired tomorrow based on a feeding frenzy, because our corporate parents they're also fearful of those that are fearful. Okay, and that goes back to the weaponization, what we had here. But social media has not been. We need to be better at how we use it in journalism.
We spend a lot of time on our ethics policy, and we've had to, I don't know about NBC, but we've rewritten it 100 times because of all the social media out there and how it evolves and how it changes. But the other part of that is, so anybody can be a journalist on social media. So that also has hurt our industry, because you could post some made-up thing and put it out there and send a link to it, and all of a sudden your friends think that's real. And so then they're like, well, he's a journalist or she's a journalist, because look what they put. And then there's this debate about, is that true or not? And then do we write about that or not? So that has been a constant struggle. And I don't know what the solution is.
One of the sort of recurring themes I have heard through the evening is we've got to learn or either practice critical thinking, which is music to the professor's ears, because that's what we try to teach them. As the moderator, it is my unfortunate responsibility to bring our evening to a close. One of our guests has a plane to catch. Thank you for very thoughtful questions. I am sorry we weren't able to get to all of them. Thank you to Ollie and the Riley Institute for sponsoring this, and Jill Fuson of the Riley Institute for all of her hard work in coordinating logistics. And thank you to our three guests, Bob, Catrice, and Chuck.